Marcus Garvey. Message to the People. The Course of African Philosophy. Edited by Tony Martin. Forward by the Honorable Charles L. James, President General of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The New Marcus Garvey Library, Number 7. Preface. The Course of African Philosophy is a unique document. With the exception of his poetic works, it is the closest thing to a book that Marcus Garvey ever wrote. Yet, 46 years after his death, it is being published here for the first time. It represents, as it were, the last political will and testament of a man who stands without equal in the history of the worldwide mobilization of African peoples. For Marcus Garvey did not merely organize the most massive Black movement in the history of the United States of America. He also organized the largest and most successful movement among African peoples in the Caribbean area. In fact, as a serious pan-Caribbean movement cutting across political and linguistic barriers, Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, has no serious challenger. Garvey's organization has an equally singular record in Africa, where it established itself, oblivious of political and linguistic barriers, in the European colonies of Europe, France, Belgium, and Portugal, as well as in the independent state of Liberia and the racist state of South Africa. In Central America, too, the UNIA spread with great rapidity from Mexico to Panama. In Canada, it entrenched itself coast to coast from British Columbia to Nova Scotia. Scattered Africa fell within Garvey's organizational genius in every far-flung corner, whether Brazil, Australia, or Barry Dock, Wales. Garvey lived from 1887 to 1940. His years of all-encompassing triumph coincided with his sojourn in the United States from 1916 to 1927. His emigration to that country was, however, preceded by many long years of preparation for his life's work, long years of study, travel, and organizational work, culminating in the founding of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in his Jamaican homeland in 1914. After his expulsion from the United States in 1927, Garvey's organization underwent a long and slow decline, and the chief struggled to hold together his fragmenting colossus from inadequate headquarters in Jamaica and later in England. It was in 1937, 10 years after his deportation from the United States, 2 years after relocating to England, and 3 years before his death, that Garvey introduced his course of African philosophy. This was nothing less than a distillation of a lifetime of organizational experience. It contained a mixture of the techniques he himself had utilized to achieve success and an attempt to incorporate the hard lessons he had learned with the benefit of an unfortunate hindsight. Much of the Machiavellian quality of the document comes from this latter consideration. Garvey had experienced in a painful way the treacherous potential enveloped within human nature. If he had his life to live over, he seemed to be saying his would be a less trusting, a more cautious approach to people. The immediate purpose of the course of African philosophy was to train a cadre of UNIA leaders who would carry on the great work of the organization after Garvey's death. And Garvey designed the 22-lesson in London and took them to Canada, where from August 24th to 31st, 1937, he conducted a regional conference for North American members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey's initial vehicle for imparting his accumulated experience was the School of African Philosophy, which met immediately after the conference. For most of the month of September 1937, Garvey trained a select group of UNIA organizers from the North American field. They spent 12 or more hours together every day. They listened to Garvey's lectures, ate together, did their homework together. During the course of the month, each student was required to write out each lesson in his or her own handwriting. The course described by Garvey as a most rigid system of training covered over 42 subjects. Much of it remained unwritten, for it was in the nature of a confidential in-house affair. Even the 22 written lessons reproduced here were guarded jealously from indiscriminate circulation. Garvey's overriding concern was to develop within his organizers a fierce Afrocentric view of the world. He accepted as given the fact that the white race had imposed its viewpoint on the world, and he thought that African people would have to adopt similar strategies in their own behalf. The race-first position would tolerate no permanent allies from among other groups. Whites were to be manipulated where possible, but their propaganda was to be avoided and counteracted. Under no circumstances were they to obtain positions of influence or control over black organizations. The course, reported the Boston Chronicle, after an interview with Garvey, would instill an independent outlook, a philosophy entirely Negroid, void of anything that will subjugate the mind of the Negro. In the context of a confidential conclave, and with his lifetime of experience behind him, Garvey could be much less guarded in his speech than would have been the case otherwise. While forcefully attempting to lead his people out of the domination of the white group, he could accordingly frankly admire their methods. Whites knew exactly what they wanted, and in the final analysis, subordinated much else to their pursuit of racial self-interest. Never swallow wholly what the white man writes or says without first critically analyzing it. He taught in Lesson 2. But this did not mean that the African race should eschew the white group's methods. Things that may not be true, he suggested in the same lesson, can be made so if you repeat them long and often enough. Therefore, always repeat statements that will give your race status and an advantage. This is how the white man has built up his system of superiority. Garvey, in his heyday, had had to contend with white self-interest and opportunism from both right and left. He simultaneously praised Lenin and Trotsky for their work in the Soviet Union and resisted the unprincipled attempts of the Communist Party of the USA to bore from within his organization. Here, in the course of African philosophy, he presented his students with a rare evaluation of Karl Marx. Communism, he said, was founded principally on the theory of Karl Marx, who knew very little about Negroes, and who thought and wrote less about them. It seeks to put government in the hands of an ignorant white mass who have not been able to destroy their natural prejudices toward Negroes and other non-white people. On the question of Jews, as on the question of communists, Garvey's race-first position led him to a duality of attitude. In traditional Afro-American vein, he praised the Jews for their group solidarity and resented their position of influence and power in certain economic and political aspect of Black life. He himself had come into business contact with Jews at various times and with both good and bad results. He showed considerable pique during his trial for alleged mail fraud in 1923, where the presiding judge, Julian Mack, happened to be an important figure in North American Zionism. For the most part, there should be few surprises in these lessons for those already familiar with Garvey's ideology. What we find here is his standard fear of race first, whether in religion, literature, historical studies, intergroup relations, or in any other area, self-reliance and nationhood. What is new and fascinating is the tone of many of these utterances, coming as they do near the end of his life and in confidential setting. Equally new in emphasis, though not in substance, is his insistent advocacy of discipline. Garvey emerges here beneath the flamboyance usually associated with his name, beneath the genius for organizing, beneath the oratorical eloquence for which he was legendary, as an advocate of hard work, singleness of purpose, and self-discipline. The leader must strive to master his shortcomings, he says. The race must strive for excellence. The greatest men and women in the world burn the midnight lamp, nor does he spare the lazy and unmotivated within his own group. Like a Booker T. Washington or a Malcolm X or an Elijah Muhammad, Garvey was not one to cover up the shortcomings of his own people. The majority of the Negroes are ignorant, he says in Lesson 21, but the intent, as always, is positive. As other people were willing to sacrifice their time and even their lives to Christianize our race, so we must exercise patience and time to civilize our people. Garvey cannot, any more than anybody else, escape totally from the confines of his time. There is much associated homely advice on diet, grooming, and love, among other things. Some of this is timeless, but some seems dated and passé from the perspective of 4 decades later. The lessons are not without their unexpected asides of dry humor either. Never try to make a speech on a hungry stomach, he warns. You may faint and die before you are finished. The first course of African philosophy was followed by examinations held on September 23, 1937. 10 students were successful. They were Arthur C. Moore of Toronto, Charles L. James of Gary, Indiana, James R. Stewart of Cleveland, Ohio, Thomas W. Harvey of Philadelphia, Nathaniel Grissom of Chicago, Mrs. Sarah Richardson Isaacs of Philadelphia, Mrs. Ethel Waddell of Chicago, Miss Teresa E. Young of Cincinnati, Mrs. Eleanor White of Chicago, and Abraham R. Roberts of Toronto. Joseph L. Gray of Charleston, Missouri, did not graduate but was continued as a student. The first group of graduates was immediately sent out as UNIA commissioners to the North American field. Some of them in due course instructed classes in the course of African philosophy. C.L. James taught the course in Gary, St. Louis, and New Orleans. James Stewart offered the course in Cleveland. 3 of the 10, Stewart, Harvey, and James, in turn occupied the organization's highest post, that of President General. In 1938, Garvey introduced the lesson as a correspondence course conducted from his London headquarters. His Black Man magazine published the names of 7 graduates in its June 1939 number. 4 were from the United States, with 1 each from Nigeria, Uganda, and South Africa. They were Benjamin W. Jones of Philadelphia, J.O. Nwanolu of Onitsha, Nigeria, Mrs. H.T. McNary of Detroit, D.S. Musoke of Kampala, Uganda, Mrs. Katura Paul of New York City, H. Ilitindro of Cape Province, South Africa, and Mrs. E. M. Collins of New York City. Names of additional graduates were promised for the next issue of The Black Man, but no further issues were published. Garvey died the following year on June 10, 1940. The School of African Philosophy came at the end of many years of UNIA efforts in the field of education. The organization's original aim and objects in 1914 included the establishment of educational institutions. Garvey's trip to the United States in 1916 was intended initially as a fundraising tour for the UNIA's projected agricultural and industrial school in Jamaica. At various times during the 1920s, the organization ran a Booker T. Washington University in Harlem, New York, a Liberty University in Claremont, Virginia, and in-service courses for UNIA civil servants. Branches in several countries ran elementary and secondary schools. Famous educators and scholars such as Hubert H. Harrison, J. A. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, and many more were associated with the organization at one time or another. UNIA schools had always had the same ultimate purpose, namely the presentation of an Afrocentric perspective. The School of African Philosophy had itself been in the making from early as 1934. In that year, the UNIA's 7th International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World, meeting in Kingston, Jamaica, authorized the establishment of a college for the purpose of training leaders who are to supervise the work in different parts of the world. Intelligence, said Garvey in the Course of African Philosophy, rules the world, and ignorance carries the burden. The intelligence of which he spoke was not merely book learning, but the self-interested common sense which the race seemed to lack. He expressed in this way in a fictitious father-son dialogue in 1935. Education, boy, is a mighty force. It is the weapon of human control. If you can educate a people in the idea that you have, they will react to your satisfaction, whether the education as a propaganda is right or wrong. It is fitting that the UNIA's last educational endeavor in Garvey's lifetime should have been the first that he was himself able to conduct from start to finish. I have given them all I know, he declared to the people of Detroit in 1937. I am trying to make everyone a Marcus Garvey personified. Tony Martin, November 10th, 1985, Wellesley, Massachusetts.